love will stand every test of time. Through thick and thin, you'll always be mine. Our love will stand every test of time. No one could ever take your love away from me.
Hi, I'm Dave Banto. Welcome to Volume 4 of the Basics of Home Recording series. Today we're going to learn how to do a final mix. If you haven't seen Volume 1 and Volume 3 on the series, you might want to go back and watch them. The reason is, in Volume 1 we showed you how to set up and use a mixing console, how to track properly, and in Volume 3 we showed you all the different types of outboard gear there are, including effects units, compressors, gates, how to hook them up and how to work them. Well, today we're going to deal with the problem we have as songwriters, performers, and engineers with doing a mix. As a mixing engineer, the most common question I'm asked is, how do I do a mix that sounds good on every system? When I was a young engineer working on a little 4 and 8 track out of my house, the mixes that I did would sound good in some places but bad in others. They might sound great in the car but sound bad at a friend's house, or sound great at a friend's house but bad in a car. And this was very embarrassing because I never knew exactly how the mix was going to sound unless I had people come over to my house and listen to them. That's not a problem that we can deal with in the recording industry. You cannot get VPs of A&Rs and people from record labels to come over to your house to listen to the mix. So what we need to do is we need to understand what a mix is, understand why it sounds good on some systems and bad on others, and we can make a mix that always sounds basically the same on every system. In other words, if it's going to sound great in your house, it's going to sound great everywhere. But the important thing is we need to understand why it sounds different on each and every system. One of the other problems we're going to deal with today is how to make each instrument sound clear and not compete with each other. If you have a kick drum and a bass guitar, sometimes they might fight with each other and cover each other up. If you've ever heard a mix that sounded like everything was real confused, and yet you've heard another mix where every single instrument sounded clear, that's because every instrument had its own space. The important thing about doing that is we need to understand where each instrument sits as far as like range, as far as like if we pan stuff left and right, and we're going to sit down and actually map out a mix to understand how to give each instrument its own little space so that they don't compete with each other. And then we're going to also look at how to do a mix so it sounds good on every single system, so when you send it off to the record label and they listen to it in their house, you know it's going to sound dynamite. In the first part of this video, we're going to go over the theory of mixing and understand how each different instrument works within a mix and how to make them so that they sound good. And in the second part of this video, we're going to actually sit down and use the knowledge that we learned and actually do a mix. This video is separated into 2 parts. In the first part, I'm going to show you what a mix is and how instruments work with each other, how they compete with each other, and how to prevent that from happening. So in the beginning of this video, I'm going to teach you what a mix is so you can understand. And then in the second part of this video, we're going to actually go and do a mix and use the knowledge that we've just learned. So the first thing we're going to do is learn what a mix is, what our problems we're going to deal with within a mix, and how to prevent these problems from happening. In other words, how to get instruments to sound clear together, how to get them to keep from competing with each other, and how to make the mix sound good on every single system. So let's take a look at what a mix is and how it works. A friend of mine asked me once if there was ever a day in my engineering career when all of a sudden a light bulb came on in my head and all of a sudden everything started working better for me. I had to think about it for a while at first, and then I realized that there was. Up until that point in my life, I had been working as a demo engineer around town. I understood how all the gear worked, how compressors, gates, effects worked, but none of my stuff really sounded like a record. And that day that my mixes all changed, I realized the difference between the way sound is produced in real life and the way our stereo sound systems in our cars and our house are reproducing them, the difference. The main problem that you have to deal with is in real life, if you have a live band or if you have a live orchestra, they're all standing in separate places in the room. But what our stereo systems do when they reproduce them is they basically take half of all the players in the room and jam them into the same speaker. This causes a lot of problems with competition of instruments. So in other words, if you had an orchestra, say a 30-piece orchestra, and you had 15 of those people sitting in the same chair and playing out of the same instrument, and the sound was being produced from the same spot, there would be a lot more competition than there is with them spread out around the room. So there are several different ways that we can deal with the fact that all of these instruments are basically combined and then shot out of the same speaker, ways that we can keep them separate, okay? In real life, music occurs kind of in a three-dimensional mode. There's depth in the fact that when someone sitting in the back of the room playing an instrument plays his note, it hits your ear a little bit later than someone sitting closer. So music in real life, when it's played by like a live orchestra or a live band, is a little bit more three-dimensional than a stereo sound system is. But I like to do my mixes, what I call 3D mixes, based on a third dimension. Music is really, when it comes back out of a stereo system, it's two-dimensional. It has height, which means in range, high notes, low notes, and it also has width in the fact of left to right. We can pan stuff left to right. So two of the ways that we can get instruments to stop competing with each other is we can have one play a higher note and one play a lower note. You may have noticed when you've recorded two vocals singing harmony with each other, you never really have a problem with them competing with each other. The reason is one is higher than the other, so they have their own space. They're not sitting in the same space. Well, one of the other ways that we can get things out of each other's way is to pan from left to right. So in other words, if we have, like, let's say we have a piano and a guitar playing the same exact notes in the same range. If we have them both panned to the center, they're going to compete with each other. When we pan something to the center in stereo, basically what that means, in fact exactly what that means, is it just comes out of both speakers. There really is no center in our stereo system. So if we take our guitar and we take our piano and we pan them left and right, so we have a guitar on one side and a piano on the other side, there's absolutely no way that they can compete with each other. Even though they're in the same height, they're not higher or lower than each other, they're in a different width from each other. So the first day that I started thinking of this concept of 3D mixing, and I'll show you what the third dimension is in a second, because we're going to use that also to add clarity to our mixes. The first day that I started thinking about that, I actually went out and bought a pad of graph paper. And when I sat down to do a mix, I wrote down all the instruments that I was mixing, like a lead vocal, a guitar, and I marked them in the ranges where they were and how I was panning them left and right. And then what I did was I looked at different instruments that were covering each other up and found ways to get them out of each other's way. The third dimension that I was talking about in mixing in stereo is time. If something happens at a different time than another instrument happens, then they're obviously not going to compete with each other. Sometimes we use pre-delays. If you saw video number 3, you'll know what a delay is, and I'm going to show you how to do that in a minute. To use timing to get one thing out of another thing's way, or to make two things sound different so they don't compete with each other. So the three dimensions that we have, number 1 is height. If an instrument's higher than another instrument, they're not going to compete. The second dimension that we have is width. If one instrument's panned to the left and one instrument's panned more to the right, they won't compete. And the third dimension is time. If one instrument occurs later than another instrument, then they also won't compete. Now, at the risk of getting too complex, I'm going to try to keep this real simple, but it's important that you at least understand this. I need to explain what we mean by the difference between a high note and a low note. It obviously doesn't mean that the note is higher or lower than the other, otherwise tall people would be singing high notes and short people would be singing low notes. That's not what it means. What it means is frequency of vibration. The way that sound is produced by something vibrating. A singer has vocal cords that vibrate, which causes air to vibrate. A reed on a saxophone vibrates, which causes air to vibrate. What we mean by a high note, we mean high frequency. That means the speed of the vibrations. So a high note is a note that vibrates real fast, and a low note is a note that vibrates real slow. When electronic gear changes these vibrations into something that it can store and recall later, that's basically all that recording gear does, is it stores information in a tape, like we said in another volume, or on a hard disk, or on a CD, and then it recalls that information and plays it back. What it does actually is it causes the speaker to vibrate at the same frequency and in the same way as your vocal cords did, making like a simulation. That's what happens, is the speaker vibrates like your vocal cords did. The way that electricity stores the information or the vibrations of your voice is it changes the mechanical energy, which is the air vibrating, that's mechanical energy because it's movement, into an electrical energy. And the electrical energy or the electrical pulses vibrate the same way that the air vibrated. So then it stores this electrical pulse or vibration or the changing of the current, and then it recalls it and makes the speaker vibrate in the same way. So when we talk about hertz, we're talking about, hertz means vibrations per second. We could be talking about the hertz of the vibration of your vocal cords, or we could be talking about hertz, the vibration of the electrical current, which is basically a copy of the way that the air was vibrating. Let's say I'm singing in A. Remember in one of our other volumes we said that in A was 440? If I'm singing in A that's 440 and there's someone standing next to me singing in A 440, we're not going to compete with each other in a live situation because your ears are going to pick us up different. Maybe your right ear will pick me up more than the other singer, or your left ear will pick up the other singer more than me, or if the singer's farther away, maybe their sound will hit your ear later. So there's all kinds of other variables in real life that don't occur in recording. So here's the problem. If you have two instruments playing the same frequency, coming out of the same speaker, in the same way, at the same time, always the louder one will just completely cancel out the softer one. So what we need to do is we need to move these things around so that we can have more than one person singing or playing in A, but since they're not coming out of the speaker in exactly the same way, they don't hit your ears in the same way, and thereby they don't compete. We're kind of simulating real life this way. Let's start by setting ourselves up with a little chart that we're actually going to graph out where all the instruments sit. And then after we set up a chart, we're going to look at the ranges or the frequencies of all the common instruments to see where they sit as far as height in the chart. Then we're going to start looking at different ways that we can use panning or width and also depth or time to get things out of each other's way. So grab yourself a piece of graph paper or a regular piece of paper, and we're going to set up a chart on a little mix that we can do. Okay, let's set on the left side of our paper, let's set our frequency. Our highest note, we'll put at 16K for right now, and our lowest note we'll put at 32. The human ear can hear around 20 hertz, which is 20 vibrations per second, which is the lowest note, up to around 20K, which is 20,000. Remember, K means kilohertz or thousands of hertz. So 16K would be 16,000 hertz or 16,000 vibrations per second. Well, we can hear up to 20K. And the reason I'm going from 32 to 16, there's two reasons that I'm doing that. First of all, if you remember from volume 3 that every time you double your frequency, it's one octave higher. So if you have 500, which is a little higher than A, it's around a C. 1K would be one octave higher than that. 2K would be 2 octave higher than that. 4K would be 1 octave higher than that. So each one of these numbers is an octave higher or an octave lower. Remember, to double a frequency, make something an octave higher, or to cut a frequency in half, make something an octave lower. So 250 hertz is 1 octave lower than 500 hertz. Now, in all the years that I've been mixing, I've never really, and maybe in a couple cases, especially in hip-hop, seen something go below 32 hertz, which is basically cents around. If you guys remember Earthquake the movie, that's like below 32 hertz and cents around. And I've very seldom ever had to go above 16K, but you know that it's there if you need to do it. But we're going to look at our chart here to see where the instruments sit, the basic instruments sit, as far as height, and then we're going to find other ways to move them around. Here's a simple chart showing different EQ ranges or frequency ranges of instruments and where they sit. If you look here, we have a female vocal. Now, when you're listening to a singer or you're listening to an instrument, you should also be listening to, are they singing in their high range? Are they singing in their low range? Because a girl can sing, as low as 250, some girls lower, all the way up to around 1 or 2K is the actual highest note that they can sing. But if you find that you take your EQ and you push above that, you'll hear more of the ambience, and I'll explain that to you in a minute. If you take your parametric EQ and you push 250, around 250, you're probably going to get the chest voice or the bottom voice of the female singer. If you push 1 to 2K, you're going to get the nasally attitude. If you push around 500, you're going to get the MIDI sound. And if you push above, like say 4K and above, you're going to get more of the ambient sound, more of the presence. If you look here at a male vocal, the range is about an octave lower than a female vocal. Although some bass singers and some deep singers will sing like 63 and below. I don't really pay attention to that right now. What I'm talking about is the lead singer. You're going to hear the lead singer singing around 125 up to, in actual notes, probably not higher than 500. But above that is the ambience. It's the presence of the voice. So on a male vocal, if you want to bring out the chest voice, the thickness of the voice, you want a fatter sounding male vocal, then you need to, EQing wise, push 125, maybe even a little lower if it's a deep sounding singer. If you want the mid-range of the voice, you're going to need to push around 250 to 500. And if you want more of the ambience or the presence, making them sound like they're more in the same room and not in another room, then you need to push like 1K and above. You notice that everything on the male vocal that I'm talking about is around 1 octave lower than the female vocal. Remember, to split a frequency in half is 1 octave lower, so like the lowest chest voice on a female is around 250, and the lowest chest voice on a male is around 125 for a lead singer. Here's the most interesting thing that I deal with of all is in dance music. I deal with the bass and the kick drum competing with each other. The reason you deal with the bass and the kick drum competing with each other is they have about the same range. Now, every mix I've ever done, the kick always sounded different, okay? So when I show you this range here from 32 up to 1K, this area right here is actually the ambience or the presence of the kick. Around 80 to like say 150 is the punch, is like the snap of the kick, and around 125 and below is like the thickness or the fatness of the kick. But some kick drums don't go that low. If you get like a high sounding kick drum and you try to push 32 or 63, there might not be anything there at all. So if you're turning up your EQ and it's set at 63 and it's not changing, that means you're below what that kick drum is doing. So every kick drum is different. You got to be careful though, because when you start pushing these high frequencies, you're also pushing a little hiss. So listen for tape hiss. So when you take these two and you put them together, the problem is if you have a fat kick playing with a fat bass, you're really going to have a lot of trouble. The reason is you usually pan the kick drum to the center and you usually pan the bass to the center. But there are ways to get around this. If you're lucky enough to have somebody who's got a fat kick and a real tight, high, punchy sounding bass, you're not going to have any problem, or vice versa. What you might need to do in some situations is decide, okay, well, I'm going to go with a thick bass and you're going to push the bottom on it and get a fat bass, and I'm going to go with a punchy kick and push the kick. So basically what's happening is we're not getting that frequency cancellation we were talking about. You're getting the low end of the bass and you're getting the high end of the kick, so they don't compete with each other because you're getting a higher kick than you are in the bass. Snare drums vary. There are piccolo snare drums, there are high cracky snare drums, and there are big thick snare drums. The low end of a snare drum is usually around 125 to 150. The high end of a snare drum, the actual note, the actual sound is around 1 to 2K. And then above that is like the ambience or the presence. So if I want to add some bottom end to a snare drum, it's going to be around 125. If I want to add some MIDI-ness, some like AM radio-ness to a snare drum, it's going to be around 500. And if I'm going to add some presence, some crack, some openness, it's going to be around 4K up to 16K. If you look at the hi-hat and the cymbal, it's obviously higher pitched than a snare drum. So when you're adjusting your parametric EQs on a hi-hat or a cymbal, the low end of a hi-hat, a cymbal is actually a little bit higher sounding than a hi-hat. Well, the low end of a hi-hat is around 500, 400. I found that to be the bottom meaty deepness of a hi-hat. And of course, you know, the ambience is like up around 18 and 16K. With a cymbal, the low end's just not quite as low. It would be more around 1K or something like that. But what I'm trying to do is give you guidelines, different spaces, areas to look for the low end, and different areas to look for the high end. Now here's another interesting one. This is real interesting when you're dealing with mixing. A guitar has such a wide range from its lowest note to its highest note. The first thing that I think about when I'm dealing with a guitar is he playing in his low range or is he playing in his high range? If he's playing in his low range, it's going to be around 63 to 125 will be the actual bottom of the guitar. Somewhere around 2K will be the actual high end of the guitar. Above that will be ambience. Now, a piano has a little bit deeper range than a guitar. Remember when we were talking about different instruments conflicting? A guitar is totally capable of playing in the same notes in the same range as a piano, playing the exact same notes in the same range as a piano. As a songwriter or an arranger, you probably won't want them to play the same notes. If you have like a guitar playing like a high funky part and maybe a piano playing a low rich part, there's not going to be any competition. Let's say you have a piano and a guitar playing the same part and you want to have them pan the same way. So we're going to have a little bit of a problem. We're going to have a piano and a guitar playing in the same range, playing in the center. They're going to compete with each other. Here's one of the ways that I like to deal with that. I like to either take, especially if they're playing the same part or basically the same part, I like to make a decision between the piano and between the guitar, which one that I want to be more bright and crisp and which one I want to be more warm, so that I'll EQ, like let's say in this example, I'll EQ the piano very warm sounding and I'll EQ the guitar very bright. What this does is it makes the two sound like one instrument or a totally new timbre. The word timbre means the sound of an instrument. If you take a guitar and you take a piano and you combine them in a way that they blend together, that's like a third instrument, that's like a third timbre. So the low end of this new instrument, it sounds like a piano, and the high end of this new instrument sounds like a guitar, or vice versa. This is what it would look like on our chart. The piano and the guitar are playing the same basic notes in the same range, the same part panned up the center. What happens is the low end of the piano overpowers the low end of the guitar and kind of cuts through, and then the high end of the guitar kind of overpowers the high end of the piano and cuts through. So this way we can have mono guitar, mono piano playing the same parts, panned in the center, and you might not even really hear the difference between the piano EQ'd warm and the guitar EQ'd bright and what they would be normal. It's just enough that the guitar kind of sneaks out on the top and the piano kind of sneaks out on the bottom. One of the ways that we can get a piano and a guitar that are playing the same part out of the way of each other, if you want them to sound balanced, if you don't want guitar on one side and piano on the other, if you want them both to sound kind of like centered, they don't have to really always be centered to sound centered, is we could put the guitar in the center and we could take a stereo piano and pan it left and right. So the piano's not heavy on one side. The piano's kind of like almost in the center. It's just stereo, and the guitar's in the center. This keeps the piano and the guitar out of the way of each other because the guitar's in the center and the piano is panned left and right. One of the things I like to use my artificial stereo on most commonly is backup vocals. In my business, I deal with high-paid backup vocalists who come in and sing the parts perfectly, but they get paid a lot of money per hour. We'll just have them come in and track it once. Like, let's say there are 3 singers coming in, singing a 3-part harmony on a backup vocal. We'll have them come in, we'll have them sing their three backup vocals, and then rather than having them singing again and doubling it, we send them home and I run it through an effect unit that makes it sound like it's doubled, like they stayed and they did another track. This is especially useful for you people at home that are working on 4 and 8 tracks. It's not because you can't keep the singer there, but it's because you're limited on tracks. You could take these 3 vocalists, and as we learned in volume 1, record them all onto one track, which is basically you think you might be stuck with mono, but you're not. So let's take a look at some different ways that we can take backup vocals and run them in stereo when they were only sang one time. There are essentially 3 ways to create artificial stereo. Let's take a look at these 3 ways and how they can be useful in helping us to give instruments their own space. If you're going to set yourself up so that you can run something from mono to an artificial stereo, like let's say you have recorded a piano on off a MIDI keyboard onto one track on the tape player, but you want to have it in your mix in stereo. One of the simplest ways to take it is take track out from your tape machine. Let's say you recorded a piano on track 1 in mono. Track 1, it's obviously in mono. Get yourself a Y chord, and you come out of the tape machine into a Y chord and go into 2 separate channels, preferably next to each other on the mixing board, and then you pan one left and one right. There are pretty much only 3 ways to do artificial stereo. What I mean by that is taking something that's recorded in mono, say on one track on your tape machine, and putting it in the mix so that it comes out sounding like it's in stereo. The first way to do it would be to EQ the left side differently than the right side. Remember we said that when something is panned up the middle, there really actually is no middle. What that means is that it's coming equally out of the left side and the right side. Well, if you were to EQ the left side differently than the right side, then it would sound in stereo because the right side sounds different than the left side. This is most commonly used for taking a piano and plugging it into 2 channels, which I'll show you how to do in a minute, and EQing one side so it's warm and EQing the other side so it's bright. What that simulates is when people mic real pianos in real life, they put 2 mics on the piano, one on the left side or the lower notes, and one on the right side or the higher notes, so that when someone's playing up and down the keyboard, it tends to come out, the low notes tend to come out more on one side, and the high notes tend to come out more on another side. So this would be used if you want to take a piano and you want to make it sound like a real piano that was mic'd with 2 separate microphones. One of the other ways that you can do artificial stereo is to detune the left and right sides. So in other words, if you run it through a harmonizer, you remember through volume 3, if you were to take the left side, like once again, let's say you had a vocal that was in the middle, and you were to split it into 2 channels. If you took the left side and you made it go through a harmonizer that made it just a little bit flat, not enough that it sounds out of tune to you, but just a little bit flat, and then take the right side and also pitch that up a little bit. Not enough that it's out of tune, but enough that it sounds different to you. So one side will be a little bit higher pitched than the left side. I usually like to do it about -7 cents flat and +7 cents sharp. What cents is 1/100th of a quarter tone. You remember that from volume 3. And the reason I like to make one side a little flat and one side a little sharp is that I found in my experience that your ear tends to hear the average of the 2. If you were to run both sides a little bit flat, then everything would sound flat. But if you run one side a little flat and one side a little sharp, then you tend to hear the average of it and everything seems to sound perfectly in tune. The third way that you can do artificial stereo is to time the left and right sides differently. In other words, if you take a vocal that's in mono, split it into 2 channels and run one side through a pre-delay, it would make one side a little late. I've usually found 10 to 25 milliseconds, any more than 25 milliseconds, and the vocal just sounds off. So once again, what I would do is I would split the left and right side into 2 channels on the mixing board, and I would run just one side of them through a delay unit, either the right side or the left side, and I would just delay it like say 10 to 25 milliseconds, which makes it a little bit later than the other side. You don't want to delay both sides because then it'll just sound like it's off. If you only delay one side, then it sounds like one singer standing a little bit farther away from you than the other singer is. So once again, the left side is different than the right side, and you have stereo sound. If you're going to be using a compact 4 or 8-track cassette player with a built-in mixer, you might have trouble running out of the tape machine and then into your mixing board because it might be wired internally. Some of them have outputs on the back for the individual tracks. If you have this, all you need to do is plug a wire into the track out on the back of your tape machine and then plug the other end of the wire into your mixing board, stereo left and right. Of course, you're going to be using a Y cord. If you don't have tape machine outputs on the back of your tape machine, there are other ways to do it. Let's say you have a tape machine that has vocals on track 4 and it automatically comes up on channel 4 on your mixing board. What you need to do is just plug in your effects unit like we showed you in volume 3. You plug out of your effects send on your mixer into the input of an effects unit and out of the output of an effects unit into 2 channels on your mixing board left and right. Then you can set them for a harmonizer or delay or whatever else we talked about doing artificial stereo. Now if you only have one effects send on your little mixing board, which is common on some little 4 tracks, and you want to use that for like an ambient sound, say a reverb or a delay, something to make the vocals sound live, so you can't use that, you can use your headphone send as a second effect send. What you do, let's say you have vocals on track 4 and the vocals are coming up on channel 4 on your mixing board. Remember, track is on a tape player, channel is on a mixing board. What you do is you take your headphone send just on channel 4 on your mixing board and send it to another effects unit. So come out of your cue output or your headphone output on your mixing board, go into another effects unit, then go out of that effect unit back into 2 channels on your mixing board, and then just send the track that you want to be doubled or put in stereo like you were sending it to a headphone, but instead of it being plugged into a headphone, it's plugged into a second effect unit. So this way you actually have 2 effects units going and you're using your cue or headphone send to send to the second effect unit. Start by mixing our kick drum and our bass guitar. Most likely these will be panned to the center, and if they're both in the same range, they're probably going to compete. Like I said before, you're going to have to choose if you want like a punchy, tight, clear bass and a fat kick, or vice versa. There's one other way that you can actually get away with doing a fat kick and a fat bass, or actually 2 other ways. One of the ways is you can have a deep kick and a deeper bass, or a deep bass and a deeper kick. As long as they don't sit height-wise in the same place, they can both be really low, but one has to be a little lower than the other. One of the other ways that engineers use to get the bass out of the way of the kick is they'll run a stereo chorus, which is a stereo effect on the bass, which would put the kick in the center and the bass on the left and right side. This is what that would look like on our chart. You remember from volume 3 that a chorus is an effect that has like a wave sound. Basically what a chorus means from volume 3, you remember this, is that it's a doubling sound. It makes something sound double. That makes one person sound like a chorus. Well, choruses come in stereo, so if you ran the bass through a stereo chorus, it would make it sound like 2 bass players or a chorus of bass players with 1 pan to the left and 1 pan to the right. This way the bass can be playing in the same range and the same part as the kick drum, but once again they don't compete with each other because they're in a total different place on our width scale. For the sake of keeping this mix simple, our little demo here, we're going to make the bass tight and punchy and a fat kick, and we're going to start building a mix around that. The next thing we'll add to our mix is a snare drum, which most people pan up to the center. In fact, only on one song have I ever heard it panned off to the side, but it won't present a problem because it's in a different height than the bass and the kick, so we still have plenty of clarity in our mix. The next thing we'll add to our mix is a hi-hat. Remember, the hi-hat's in a very high range. Most R&B people and pop people that mix like to pan the hi-hat to one side. So it sounds like a live drum set. That's the way a drum set would sound. The hi-hat's on one side. On virtually every hip-hop and rap album I've ever done, they ask me to put the hi-hat in the middle, which is fine because the hi-hat's so high that it's not going to cover up anything in the center. So the hi-hat's not really ever a problem. But in this mix right here, we're going to pan it to the left side to get a little stereo imagery. The next thing we'll add is a cymbal, and let's pan that to the right because that's usually where it is on a drum set. And plus it'll balance out the hi-hat left and right, so we have equal. We don't have like a mix that's weighted towards one side. We have a cymbal towards one side and a hi-hat towards the other side, which balances it out. So far everything still has its own space, and our mix is really nice and balanced. Next, let's add a little piano to our mix here. If the piano were straight up in the middle, it would cover up some of these instruments, but it wouldn't really matter so much because it's playing a totally different part. What happens is if the snare is louder than the piano, for that 1 second that the snare drum hits, it covers up the piano, but it's totally unnoticeable because they're playing different parts. They're kind of changing off. One gets to play a note, then another one gets to play a note. But it'll be more clarity in the mix if we take the piano and put it in stereo. So we have the kick, the bass, and the snare always have their own space, and the piano pan left and right, so that when the snare hits, it doesn't ever cover up the piano. Now let's add a stereo guitar to our mix. We probably don't want to put a full stereo guitar in our mix because we have stereo piano. And with the guitar pan totally left and right, or it's called hard pan, when you pan it all the way to the left and all the way to the right, and also having a piano pan all the way to the left and all the way to the right, they're going to be in the same square on our chart. So what we'll probably want to do is pan our guitar, like say 9 o'clock to the left and 3 o'clock to the right, so that they're not all the way panned or hard pan left and right, which will give them a little bit different space than the piano, and it'll give it a little bit of breathing room. If our guitar is not already in stereo, we could also use one of the 3 ways that I showed you to do artificial stereo on the guitar. If you're doing artificial stereo on the piano and artificial stereo on the guitar, you probably want to use different ways, like say on the piano EQing the left side and the right side different, and on the guitar maybe detuning one side or delaying one side, so that they're different types of stereo. That'll also give a little bit more separation to the guitar and the piano. Now, when we add our lead vocal in our mix, right in the center, there's a big open space for it. So we'll get a lot of clarity out of our male lead vocal. When you look at this graph, it may look like the snare is going to compete with the lead vocal, but it doesn't really, because remember we said that if they're playing different parts, they tend to trade off. For the split second that the snare hits, you might not hear the lead vocal, but it's such a short time that it doesn't really matter. They tend to trade off. Now we'll add our stereo backup vocals, which I like to hard pan. It may look like the stereo backup vocals are going to compete with the piano because they're both hard pan, but they're probably playing different parts. So just like the lead vocal and the snare, they trade off. The backup vocals are probably only playing in the choruses, and the piano will cut through the cracks time-wise. So these two are actually in different places as far as time, just like the snare and the lead vocal are in different places as far as time.
Through thick and thin, you'll always be my
valuable tip that I can give you, let's say you're checking your mix, you're at the end of the mix, like we just were, and something sounds off. Let's say your vocal sounds not loud enough. Every time I go to make a move or make a change to my mix, I try to think in reverse. What I mean by that is, if I think my vocal's not loud enough, before I turn up my vocal, I'll stop and think, well, why is my vocal not loud enough? Is there something covering it up? If there is something covering it up, then I might choose to turn that down rather than turn the vocal up. I need to weigh in my mind which would be better, turning the vocal up or turning that particular instrument down. Another good example is, let's say that you have a piano playing pads, and let's say the low end of the piano is covering up the clarity on the bass, which I found to happen if you happen to have the bass and the piano both pan to the center. Rather than turning the piano up or down, you might want to consider turning the high end of the bass up, or let's say the bass already has enough high end, you might want to consider turning the low end of the piano down, giving a little more clarity on the bass. Now we have a balanced mix and everything has its own space and everything's really clear. By now you may have guessed, if you've seen Volume 3, that there are several other things that we can do to improve a mix. Remember, Volume 3 was on outboard gear, compression, gates, effects units. What we saw in this video just in the past few minutes was just a way to use effects units to make artificial stereo. Well, there are other ways to use the effects units, like we saw in Volume 3, to make more ambient sounds. For example, one of the problems that we just saw a few minutes ago was the snare and the vocal are pretty much in the same range in their pan to the center. What they're doing is they're trading off in time-wise. In the third dimension, which remember was time, they're not in the same place, so they're giving a little breathing space. Well, if you take a stereo reverb and you put it either on the lead vocal or on the snare or on both, that gives it even more breathing room, because when the snare, let's say that there's reverb on the lead vocal and the snare's pan to the center, if the snare covers up the lead vocal for a split second in the center, it won't cover up the reverb to the lead vocal, so the reverb will kind of wrap around the snare and cut around the sides. Likewise, if you have a stereo reverb on the snare and the vocal covers up that snare, it won't cover up the trail of the reverb that's on the snare drum. If you have the option to do this, which I do in a lot of the big studios I work at, some of the rooms I work in have as many as 144 channels on the mixing board, and I have a whole rack of reverb units. I use a different reverb on the snare drum than I will on the lead vocal, or maybe just pan it a different way. So once again, the two reverbs are different reverbs and they're panned differently, so that those reverbs also have different breathing room, rather than just having one reverb and sending all of my instruments through it. But if you don't have the ability to do that, we could still get a great mix by panning stuff and EQing stuff differently, like we just showed you. One of the other ways that we can improve a mix is through compression. If you remember in Volume 3, we talked about how compression was originally made to control changes in volumes. It keeps instruments or vocals from sticking out or getting lost. It'll compress the volume changes. Go back to Volume 3 and watch that and you'll remember what I was talking about. It'll compress the volume changes so that the peaks won't be so loud and the low spots won't be so soft. This thereby balancing the volumes of everything so they're more consistent. But one of the side effects of compressors is, remember in Volume 3 we talked about the resistance that it adds. It adds more tightness, or it adds more attitude to an instrument. This resistance that the compressor has that changes in volume gives more intensity to the sound. I virtually always compress my kick, snare, and vocals going to tape, and also playing back from tape. I usually compress my vocals at 4:1 with a threshold of about 0, and then I adjust it from there for each particular vocal. I usually compress my kick drums and my bass drums, remember from Volume 3, at a lower ratio so they won't tend to lose so much low end. So I usually compress my kick drums and my bass at about 2:1. Even if I'm not having volume problems with it, I do it just because it gives more snap, more punch, and more attitude to everything that you put compression on. Compression is particularly great for lead guitars, even if you're not having volume problems, because it gives it a lot more attitude. Basically anything that you want more pump or more attitude to, try a little compression and you'll see that it works great, particularly in dance music.
Through thick and thin, you'll always be.
Another thing that I like to use in my mixes to improve performance or improve the sound of the mix is a noise gate. You remember from volume 3 that a noise gate was actually used to cut out noise in between someone singing, to cut out cars passing by or airplanes going over or headphone noise or tape hiss. Well, if you put your noise gate on, let's say, a snare drum, and if you adjust your release time so that it's timed to a certain time within the music, it'll cut the end of the snare drum off. So rather than a snare drum going pow, it'll go psst, psst. And if you time that with the music, it tends to make everything sound a little tighter, a little more uniform, because the cutoffs of a snare, or if you use it on the bass, cutoffs of the bass will be more timed with the tempo of the music. Some of the better bass players that I work with cut their notes off in time with the music, and I don't need to do that. But I almost always, in fact I'd say always, use noise gates on my kick and snare, and I time the cutoffs so that they're in tempo with the music, so it goes tss, tss, and then I add a little reverb to that. It still sounds natural, it doesn't sound artificially cut off, but the length of the snare and the length of the kick drum are timed perfectly to the music. And it tends to give more uniformity to the mix. And it makes everything sound like it's supposed to be together. Some of the other effects that I like to use to improve on my mixes, sometimes try a stereo reverb to a hi-hat. The hi-hat's panned to one side, but if you add a stereo reverb to it, the reverb tends to trail to the opposite side. So when the hi-hat's done, you tend to hear the reverb more on the other side. It makes the hi-hat sound more like a hi-hat in a real live room, and the hi-hat won't sound so artificial. That's if you're using some MIDI hi-hat, a keyboard hi-hat. If you're miking live drums, the other mics on the drum will pick up the hi-hat and will have the same type of effect. One of the other effects that I like to use to simulate live rooms is an echo. I like to put echoes sometimes on my backup vocals or on my lead vocals along with reverb. It tends to make it sound like the vocals bouncing off of walls, and it gives it a nice trail. You wouldn't want to do that so much if somebody's singing fast notes. I like to use it at the end of phrases, like if a girl's singing a line, the very last word I like to have the echo on, because if she's singing some fast words and there's an echo going along with it, it tends to add confusion. Some of the more expensive echo units have what's called a ducker. What a ducker is as long as the effect unit is receiving signal from the vocal, the echo won't kick on. But as soon as that signal stops, or as soon as the girl stops singing, then the echo kicks on. Those units are very expensive, but if you don't have one, you could do it by hand just by turning your echo on the last word of a girl singing so that the echo's just on the end. If that's a little too complex, you might want to, if you have an open track, record to an echo to another track and just punch in the echoes in the right spot, so one open track is just an echo which has been timed in the right spots. I showed you how to use choruses and pitch changers to double things, to put them in stereo, to thicken things. Choruses and pitch changers are usually made to double or to thicken things, and that's what I usually like to use them for. That's why it's good to put a chorus on the bass, because it thickens the bass, or a chorus on a vocal. If I have somebody who has a very thin vocal sound, I might detune it and put it with itself if it's not causing a pitch problem. Otherwise, I might just add a chorus to it, because remember from volume 3 that a chorus is like a doubling of the vocal. It'll thicken up the vocal sound. Some big famous artists use a little bit of chorus in there to thicken up their sound, so little bit that it's not really that noticeable, but I can hear it, and if you listen closely, you'll be able to hear it also. One of the other things that I like to do, if you have enough channels on your mixing board, is I like to return particularly my reverbs into channels on the mixing board so that I can EQ them. The reason I like to do that is I like to take my lead vocal, and let's say my lead vocal is a female singer singing A440, I like to roll a little A440 out of my reverb that leaves a little hole or a little space for the vocal to cut through. So you have the female vocal singing here, and you have a reverb which tends to cut through a little bit above the lead vocal and a little bit below the lead vocal, giving the lead vocal a chance to breathe a little more. And then there's a lot less of the lead vocal being washed out by the effect. You can actually turn the effect up a little bit more, but the lead vocal's got its own space and it cuts through. That's also why I like to use a stereo reverb, because you have your lead vocal in the center and you have a stereo reverb. It gives the lead vocal a little bit more chance to breathe, so you can use a little bit more reverb and it doesn't tend to wash out or cover up the lead vocal. If you happen to be running more than one effect on a vocal, let's say you're running a delay or a little slapback or a delay or an echo on a lead vocal, and you're also running a reverb, what I like to do, if you have enough channels, some people do, if you don't, that's fine. What I like to do to add a little more clarity is I'll put the delay or the echo on the lead vocal, then I'll return the delay or the echo into channels on my mixing board, and I'll add the reverb to the delay or echo. This way all three things are not happening at the same time. The vocalist will sing, then a split second later the echo will happen, and then a millisecond later the reverb will come on the echo, giving each its own space in the third dimension, letting all these different effects have a chance to breathe so they don't all occur at the same time. You have the illusion that they're occurring at the same time because they happen so fast, but in reality they have their own little space, and it gives a lot more clarity. It enables you to use a lot more effects without everything sounding so cluttered and so washed out. There's a few other things that you need to be concerned with when you're doing a mix to be played on several different systems. One of the things you need to be concerned with is all systems don't play back music the same. A small little portable cassette player that you might take with you to the beach won't reproduce the low end the way a big home stereo system does. Also, a lot of the new home stereo speakers purposely boost low end and high end because they give it an extra fatness and an extra little bit of clarity. You need to be careful not to get too much low end for these speakers. Another thing is, like, little small speakers cannot reproduce real deep lows. Some speakers only produce like 40 hertz and above. You remember what 40 hertz was? While some big home stereo speakers will produce 40 and below. So if I have a really deep fat bass and I'm mixing on some little speakers, I might be deceived because I'm not hearing the real deepness of the bass. So one of the things I'll do when I'm mixing on little speakers as a final check is play it back on some big speakers and pay attention specifically to the real deepness of the bass. If you get the real deepness of the bass at the right volume, then it'll sound the same on little speakers as it does on big speakers, and it'll just sound deeper on bigger speakers. One of the other things you need to be concerned with is the overall EQing of a mix does not sound the same when you play it back at different volumes. Take a mix that you have or a CD that you bought at the store and put it in your stereo system and play it back at the lowest volume that you can hear. You notice that there's a lot less bass and a lot less hi-hat than there is when you turn it up at the loudest volume you can stand. As you turn up the volume, the bass and the bright highs increase at a greater rate than the mids do. So one of the last and final checks that I do when I have a mix that I like is I'll turn the volume down as low as I can to where I can barely hear it, and I'll make sure that the bass and the real high instruments like the hi-hat don't disappear. Then I'll turn it up as loud as I can, and I'll make sure that the bass and the hi-hat aren't too loud. This will also apply in helping it sound better on different systems, because remember, different systems play back with more low end and less low end. Well, what you're doing is you're checking it at the full range, from the lowest low end that you'll hear and the lowest high end that you'll hear to the loudest low end that you'll hear and the loudest high end that you'll hear. I found from experience that when I've got a mix that sounds good at the softest volume that I play it back at and at the loudest volume that I play it back at, it almost always sounds good on every single system.
Our love will stand every test of time. Through thick and thin, you'll always be mine. stand every test of time. No one could ever take your love